This is not how wars announce their consequences. Most people think Donald Trump succeeded. He killed Ayatollah Khamenei. He struck Iranian nuclear facilities. He demonstrated American military superiority in ways that reminded the world why the United States remains the most powerful nation on earth. The headlines focus on explosions in Tehran. The analysts debate whether this marks the end of the Islamic Republic. And while the world watches Iranian defenses crumble under waves of American and Israeli airstrikes, something far more structural just happened in the global energy system. Something that turned Trump's military victory into Russia's economic windfall. Something that proves overwhelming force means nothing when geography and necessity override political alignment. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, not as a temporary gesture, not as a symbolic protest. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps broadcast on open maritime frequencies that no commercial vessel is permitted to pass. Within 72 hours, insurance companies pulled coverage. Shipping conglomerates rerouted their fleets. And 20% of the world's oil supply, 21 million barrels per day, $500 billion in annual energy trade, stopped moving through the narrow waterway between Iran and Oman. Trump thought killing Iran's supreme leader would break the regime's will to resist. Instead, it gave Tehran the justification to deploy the one weapon America cannot counter, with aircraft carriers or precision missiles, control over 33 kilometers of water that the global economy depends on. The Strait of Hormuz is barely wider than the distance between two suburbs. At its narrowest point, the shipping lanes are 3 kilometers in each direction. 100% of that corridor sits within Iranian and Omani territorial waters under international law. Iran does not need to physically blockade the strait with warships or plant mines across the seabed. They just need to make transit uninsurable. Declare it an active war zone. Station anti-ship missiles on the 3 islands they control at the entrance. Fire warning shots at a few tankers. And the entire global shipping industry stops using it voluntarily because no corporation will risk a $200 million crude carrier and crew in contested waters, where insurance premiums just hit 6-year highs, and Lloyd's of London refuses to underwrite transit. That is exactly what happened. Iranian vessels still pass through. Chinese-flagged tankers navigate the strait without insurance because Beijing does not care about Western underwriting standards. A handful of Russian ships transit because Moscow operates outside international insurance markets anyway. But the massive crude carriers that move Saudi, UAE, Kuwaiti, and Iraqi oil to Asian refineries, the LNG tankers supplying energy to Europe and Japan, the container ships connecting Gulf ports to global supply chains, all of them anchored in safe waters or rerouted thousands of kilometers to avoid the risk. Not because the strait is physically blocked, because it became economically unviable to use it. Here is the structural problem Trump did not anticipate. Closing Hormuz devastates everyone who depends on Gulf energy exports except Iran. Saudi Arabia ships 7 million barrels per day through the strait. The United Arab Emirates, 3 million. Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, all of them rely on Hormuz to reach global markets. Their economies collapse without access to that waterway. Iran exports roughly 2 million barrels daily, and most of that moves through sanctions evading networks using older tankers and buyers who already operate outside Western financial systems. So when Iran makes Hormuz unusable for commercial traffic, they lose a fraction of their export capacity. But U.S. allies in the Gulf lose nearly everything. And the countries that depend on those imports, China, India, Japan, South Korea, face immediate energy supply crises that force them to find alternatives. Alternatives that do not involve American alliance suppliers or U.S. strategic interests. China is the world's largest crude importer, 14 million barrels per day. Half of that traditionally transited through Hormuz from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, and Iran. When the strait became a no-go zone, Chinese refiners faced 3 options. Drain strategic petroleum reserves and hope the crisis resolves within weeks, cut refining output and trigger domestic fuel shortages and economic slowdown, or pivot immediately to alternative suppliers who can deliver volume through routes that bypass Middle Eastern choke points entirely. They chose the third option without hesitation. And the only supplier with the spare capacity, existing infrastructure, and willingness to absorb millions of barrels per day on short notice is Russia. Russia was already exporting record volumes to China before the Iran war started. Over 2 million barrels per day of crude moving via the Eastern Siberia Pacific Ocean pipeline and seaborne shipments from Pacific ports. None of it transits Hormuz. None of it requires insurance from London. None of it depends on Middle Eastern stability or American military protection. And critically, Russia has spare export capacity because Western sanctions over Ukraine forced Moscow to redirect volumes away from Europe toward Asia over the past 3 years. China was moderating Russian crude purchases in late 2025, trying to maintain supply diversification and avoid overdependence on Moscow. The Hormuz closure eliminated that restraint overnight. Within days of the U.S. strikes on Iran, commodity tracking data showed Chinese independent refiners, the teapot operations in Shandong province, increasing Russian crude purchases by over 300,000 barrels per day. These refiners account for roughly 20% of China's total refining capacity. They were the largest buyers of discounted Iranian crude before the war. Now they cannot get Iranian barrels because Hormuz is closed and U.S. secondary sanctions make remaining Iranian shipments too risky during active hostilities. So they turn to Russia, which offers similar discounts, $10 to $11 per barrel below benchmark prices, and delivers through routes with zero exposure to U.S. military operations or Middle Eastern conflict zones. India faces an even more severe crisis. 50% of India's crude imports transit the Strait of Hormuz. That represents nearly 2.6 million barrels per day from Gulf producers. India activated emergency protocols immediately, drawing down strategic petroleum reserves, but those reserves cover roughly 10 days of consumption at current rates. India cannot afford to wait for diplomatic negotiations to reopen Hormuz. They need oil now, and the only source capable of providing the volume India requires without involving the strait is Russia. India and Russia built extensive energy trade relationships during the Ukraine war when New Delhi became one of the largest buyers of Russian crude that European markets stopped purchasing. Those networks reactivated instantly under crisis conditions. And unlike the United States, Russia does not lecture India about energy sovereignty or impose secondary sanctions for trading with suppliers Washington disapproves of. This is the structural realignment Trump failed to understand. The Hormuz closure is not temporary leverage Iran will surrender once bombing campaigns end. It is permanent reordering of energy dependency patterns. Chinese refiners who switch supply sources during emergencies and discover the logistics work reliably do not switch back just because the original routes eventually reopen. Indian importers who build new infrastructure around Russian pipelines and Arctic shipping routes do not abandon those investments the moment Saudi tankers can transit Hormuz again. Energy infrastructure decisions operate on 10 to 20-year planning horizons. Once major importers redirect their supply chains, the redirection becomes structural, and that structural shift directly benefits Russia while permanently eroding U.S. influence over global energy markets. Russia is generating windfall profits without firing a shot. Not because Moscow planned brilliantly or executed complex strategy, because they are geographically positioned to benefit when Middle Eastern energy becomes inaccessible. Russian oil does not transit Hormuz. Russian gas exports to China move through pipelines that bypass the Middle East entirely. Russian willingness to sell energy without political conditions or human rights lectures makes them the default alternative the instant U.S.-aligned suppliers become unreachable. When Trump attacked Iran, he handed Russia the greatest economic opportunity Moscow has received since Europe's panic over Ukraine drove LNG prices to record levels. Commodity market analysts estimate that if Hormuz remains restricted for more than 3 weeks, Russia will capture between $400 and $600 billion in long-term energy contracts as Asian buyers lock in alternative supply arrangements. That is not revenue from temporarily higher prices during a crisis. That is permanent market share, transferred from Gulf producers to Russian exporters. Because the infrastructure relationships and long-term commitments get established during emergencies and persist decades after the immediate crisis ends. This exact dynamic played out during the Ukraine war. Europe cut Russian gas purchases. Prices spiked. Russia redirected those volumes to Asia at slightly lower prices, but with long-term contracts that replaced what they lost in European markets. Now the same pattern is accelerating with oil. Trump closes Hormuz by attacking Iran. Asian buyers panic about supply security. Russia offers volume through safe routes. Contracts get signed. And a decade from now, when historians analyze the Iran war, those contracts will still be in force, and Russian energy dominance in Asia will be locked in as a direct consequence of American military action. The strategic irony is profound. The United States cannot replace Gulf supply to Asia at the scale required. America produces 13 million barrels of crude per day. Most of that is consumed domestically or exported to nearby markets like Canada and Mexico. U.S. LNG exports are growing, but still represent a fraction of what Qatar and other Gulf states supply to Asian markets. So when Hormuz closes, the United States cannot step in as a substitute supplier. They can offer token shipments, perhaps a few 100,000 barrels per day, but nothing approaching the multi-million barrel gap that China, India, Japan, and South Korea need, filled immediately. Russia can. Russia has the production volume, the pipeline infrastructure, the willing buyers, and the operational experience selling to Asian markets without Western financial system involvement. China and India, already frustrated with U.S. tariffs, sanctions threats, and constant political pressure, have zero hesitation about deepening their energy dependence on Moscow if it ensures their economies continue functioning. Trump wanted to demonstrate that American military power reshapes the Middle East according to Washington's preferences. He succeeded in proving that American missiles can eliminate Iranian leaders and destroy nuclear facilities. But he simultaneously demonstrated that American power cannot control global energy flows when geography and economic necessity override political alignment. Iran does not need to defeat the U.S. military in direct combat. They just need to make the strait unusable long enough for alternative supply chains to solidify and become permanent. Every day Hormuz remains closed is another day Chinese and Indian refiners deepen relationships with Russian exporters. Another day new long-term contracts get negotiated. Another day the post-Hormuz energy landscape becomes more entrenched and irreversible. The broader economic consequences cascade across the global system. Oil prices spiked immediately after the closure. Brent crude hit levels not seen since the initial Ukraine war supply disruptions. But this time, the price increase is not driven by speculation about potential disruption. It is driven by actual supply shortages as 20% of globally traded oil stops moving. Refiners cannot source feedstock at previous volumes. Prices rise. Fuel costs increase everywhere. Inflation accelerates across economies still recovering from previous energy shocks. And because oil markets are globally integrated, even countries that do not import through Hormuz feel the price impact. American consumers watch gasoline prices climb. European industries face higher energy input costs. Developing economies see their import bills explode as they compete for scarce supply at elevated prices. The International Crisis Group warned before the strikes that prolonged Hormuz closure would trigger global recession within weeks. Not months, weeks. Modern economies cannot absorb a 20% reduction in their primary energy source without massive disruption. Factories reduce production because fuel costs make operations uneconomical. Transportation networks slow as diesel prices surge. Supply chains built on predictable fuel availability collapse when those predictions fail. Central banks face impossible policy choices between raising interest rates to combat inflation or cutting rates to prevent recession from deepening. And all of this economic damage disproportionately benefits Russia, which sells oil and gas at elevated prices to buyers with no alternatives, while the United States and its allies absorb the costs of a war Trump started without securing energy supplies first. Trump's strategy relied entirely on the assumption that overwhelming military force compels surrender, destroy Iranian leadership, eliminate nuclear programs, degrade military capabilities. And Iran, confronted with American power, capitulates and accepts whatever terms Washington dictates. Except Iran is not capitulating. They deployed asymmetric leverage. They cannot match U.S. aircraft carriers or stealth bombers in conventional warfare, but they can make 33 kilometers of water unusable for the global economy. They can turn geographic control into a weapon that costs the United States and its allies hundreds of billions in economic damage, while costing Iran relatively little because their economy already operates under sanctions and outside mainstream international systems. This is the lesson Trump refuses to learn from Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and every other military intervention where overwhelming force failed to produce desired political outcomes. Military dominance does not translate into strategic control when adversaries have geographic leverage and willingness to absorb costs asymmetrically. The United States can destroy every Iranian military installation. They cannot force insurance companies to cover war zone transit. They cannot make shipping corporations risk expensive vessels in contested waters. They cannot prevent China and India from buying Russian oil when Gulf supplies become inaccessible. And they cannot reverse the structural energy realignment happening in real time as Hormuz remains closed and alternatives become permanent fixtures of the global system. U.S. allies are in crisis mode. Saudi Arabia and the UAE watch their export revenues collapse because they cannot move crude through Hormuz, and their overland pipeline alternatives, the East-West Pipeline and Fujairah route, have limited capacity that cannot handle normal transit volumes. Japan and South Korea face energy emergencies because they import 60 to 70% of their oil through the strait and maintain minimal strategic reserves compared to consumption rates. European nations warn that prolonged closure will spike their energy costs, just as economies recover from Ukraine war disruptions. And none of them can do anything except wait for Trump to negotiate an end to a conflict he initiated without coordinating with allies or planning for obvious consequences. American credibility erodes with each passing day. U.S. allies in Asia and Europe learn that American military action in the Middle East directly threatens their economic security, and that Washington either failed to consider the consequences or simply does not care about allied interests. That lesson persists long after this specific war ends. The next time the United States requests Japanese or South Korean or German support for Middle East policy, those governments remember that Trump closed Hormuz, spiked their energy costs, destroyed their supply security, and handed Russia the long-term contracts that should have gone to U.S.-aligned Gulf producers. And they will be far more skeptical about following American leadership into future crises. Russia and China are coordinating their response. The Maritime Security Belt 2026 exercise, joint naval drills between Russian, Chinese, and Iranian forces, continued in the Strait of Hormuz even as U.S. missiles struck Tehran. Russian and Chinese warships operating in the strait during active American military operations sent unmistakable signals. Moscow and Beijing view Hormuz as strategically vital and will maintain presence regardless of U.S. military action in the region. That presence complicates any American effort to forcibly reopen the strait because U.S. naval forces would operate in proximity to Russian and Chinese vessels, creating escalation risks that extend far beyond Iran and potentially trigger great power confrontation. This is the reality Trump created. He killed Khamenei. He struck nuclear facilities. He demonstrated American willingness to use overwhelming force against adversaries. And in exchange, he triggered a $500 billion energy crisis that benefits Russia, undermines U.S. allies, fractures alliance relationships, and proves that American military supremacy cannot control the global economy when adversaries exploit geographic leverage and great power. Rivals offer viable alternatives to U.S.-dominated systems. The war continues. Iranian defenses are degraded, but the strategic outcome is already determined. Trump won the battle for Tehran. Russia won the war for Asian energy markets. And the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow passage most people never thought about before this crisis, became the place where American global dominance quietly ended and multipolarity became the irreversible reality. Khamenei is dead. Iranian military infrastructure is destroyed, and Russia just locked in decades of energy dominance across Asia. That is not the victory Trump promised his supporters. That is not the outcome American strategists planned. That is the unintended consequence of believing military power alone determines geopolitical outcomes. History does not care about missile counts or carrier groups when economic necessity drives nations toward alternatives that work. The necessity created by closing Hormuz just permanently shifted global energy flows toward Russia. No amount of American firepower will reverse that structural change. Trump attacked Iran. Russia won the future, and the backfire is measured in hundreds of billions of dollars and decades of lost influence.